before we begin. I just wanted to preface this talk by sharing a little bit about how the show actually came together, because I think it speaks to how much Greg meant and continues to mean to so many artists here in Chicago. So I actually never met Greg. I moved here in July of 2021 for this fellowship at the museum and started, I believe, the week he passed away. So we were like ships in the night. And within maybe 3 or 4 weeks of my tenure here, I was assigned the next Chicago Works show. And as someone who was brand new to town, didn't know anyone, let alone an artist I wanted to do a solo show with, I scheduled as many studio visits as possible and did like 30 in 3 weeks or something. But as I was on this listening tour, I found that so many of these visits became conversations about someone named Gregory Bae. In some instances, they were sharing as sort of an aside about someone, this like beloved figure who had passed recently. In other instances, actually Greg's work and legacy were impacting the work that was being made in the studio, which maybe could be a future show or something. And even in some other cases, these artists were suggesting I really consider doing a presentation of Greg's work for this Chicago Works show. And so I really decided to listen to these whispers, to these signs, and promptly scheduled a visit with Tony Lewis, who is caring for most of Greg's work in his studio right now. And needless to say, I was blown away by what I found, and the show on view is a product of all of this. But all this to say is that it was really through those early conversations with artists here in the city that made the show happen. And even more recently, as I was organizing the show, in Greg's absence, I had to rely on so many friends and family members of Greg. And so I just really want to underscore the fact that the show on view carries the traces of so much love and generosity and care on the part of those in his inner orbit. And I think it's very fitting that we're having this conversation here today and making public a lot of the discussions I've been having in private in organizing the show. So with that, I will stop rambling and move on to our panelists. So just so everyone is sort of aware of, the positions you're all coming from, I was wondering if you could share like what your relationship was to Greg, how you met, the context in which you got to know him, and maybe from your perspective, like what his presence was like here in this city and for the art world here in this city.
Sure, I'll start. Thank you. That was beautifully put. So I met Greg the first day I moved to Chicago to attend the School of the Art Institute for MFA. He and I lived together throughout grad school and stayed friends since then. And so our first meeting was just a hi, how are you? But I feel like I really got to know him over some like kind of late night grad school style drinking and discussing sessions. Probably Tony can speak to that as well. But like kind of getting to like really understand his mind a little bit and the kind of keen intellect and analytical way of looking at the world that he brought. So those were some of the first things that struck me about him. But I feel like, do you want me to also speak to kind of his presence in Chicago as well?
Please.
So, I mean, for me, he was a collagist through and through. So his work often, uses aspects of collage or outright, are collages. And I feel like he was a connector of people. He was a locus point for a lot of different conversations. And so I think he was a really kind of an important, like, unique form of glue between different groups and different discussions and different kinds of sightlines. And, I think that it's a testament to like the amount of, the people and the varied group that's here to like kind of listen to this talk today. I mean, I think this is evidence right here. So, yeah.
So I actually met Greg a little differently than Tony and Josh. He was I was a sophomore in undergrad at SAIC in 2010 and 2011, and I believe it was in 2011 that I took Susan Kraut's painting class, and he was the TA, so he was the teaching assistant for that class. This sounds cheesy, but honestly, he was impactful as a TA. And actually, coincidentally, Josh also was my TA in undergrad, as was Tony. And it was, I think in 2015, is that when he came back from the residency?
Yes, I think so,
Yeah. So it was in 2015, just walking out of Expo, so fall, we ran into each other. I was like, oh, hey. I was surprised he recognized me. Maybe he was surprised I recognized him. But I met him. There was a appropriate lag of time, and then kind of re-met him, and quickly became friends with him. I think he kind of filled the role of a bigger brother to me, but his impact, I think the extent of that is just, at this point, it seems infinite, because he was so good at connecting people, and he knew everybody, or he was friends with everybody, and like, I'm still meeting people who specifically said, oh, Greg said I should meet you. Like, he said that we would get along. And he did that with relationships, which is kind of unique, that level of generosity with relationships. I think at that point, I didn't know if it was like purposefully like trying to form a community, but I think that's also just who he was. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with both of those. Absolutely, yes. To Josh's point, in terms, I also went to grad school. I met Josh and Greg the same day, fall of 2010, along with whoever else was in that graduate class in the painting department at SAIC. I think one of the first things I noticed being in that program was how good a painter everybody was. And it was actually very intimidating to be in that program. Josh, at the time, was a great painter. He has since become a much better painter. And Greg was also an extremely accomplished painter and collagist. And I mean, they were absolutely brilliant minds, like right off the bat, which was quite intimidating for me because I didn't have the same kind of experience or background. But it was pretty evident through a lot of these, through the learning process of, critiques, late night private critiques with students in studios. Maybe there was whiskey, maybe there wasn't. But the dialogue that was created, and the bond and the trust and the ability to sort of communicate was pretty intense. And Greg was integral to those types of conversations. So I would say when you start speaking about how we met and sort of the impact, I mean, I think we all are kind of insinuating the impact is pretty immediate, one way or the other. And actually, it seems like we're all saying that there was a good amount of education sort of happening for all of us at different levels. We were learning from Greg pretty quickly. I probably am not going to be able to answer the rest of that question eloquently because it's such a big one. But I agree with Mika in terms of the his personality, the effect he had was very instant. And I think it was a kind of natural tendency to create a sense of community. It was sort of like second nature in terms of it was not forced at all. I think that's how he found he found his way in so many different types of rooms and so many different types of circles. Just that ability to sort of communicate and have just a ridiculous amount of generosity for everyone and to have time for everyone. I think it's important to sort of say that as like a baseline, personality trait, especially when we start digging into the work and we start thinking about how he might take the same level of consideration towards material, towards painting, towards art making.
I totally agree with that, and I would also extend that, not just consideration, that level of care and consideration across all of his work, but also towards others. If he was present, he was absolutely present, and almost an unusual amount. Or to an unusual extent, that level of consideration, and just giving so much time and focus, and when he was present, he was so present.
So getting into the work a little bit, as I came to the work, I was really surprised that he came from a painting background and a pretty strictly academic oil painting background. And maybe, so in particular, Tony and Josh, as former classmates of his, I'm wondering if you could maybe describe his early painting practice and maybe, get into how it might relate to the work that is on view in the show today, which feels so different in being conceptual in nature, kinetic sculpture, right? So yeah.
Okay, could I ask for my first slide to be up? Yeah, so this is a painting from 1998 when Greg was either 11 or 12 years old. It won some kind of a watercolor painting prize. I don't know if you'd appreciate me showing this, but it's a pretty mind-blowing painting, and it makes me think of the word prodigy a little bit.
Can you repeat the age?
I think he was either 11 or 12. But 1998. So he just had kind of an innate talent with paint and control over material, and I think he extended that through his years at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, and then that's what he was coming in with going to SAIC. And I think a lot of people, come out of their MFA a little different from how they come in, and I think that the effects of his education kind of continued to both take hold and to wear off in a way in those 2-3 years after. Could we go to, why don't we look at slide 2, or sorry, it's a short video, and it's something he was saying, I think, in his second year of grad school when he's making these kind of immersive installation paintings, and he's kind of sitting in front of one of them. And this gives us a moment to look into where he was at that time, and then I want to say something about how he kind of shifted and progressed from there.
My work at this point has stemmed from a traditional approach to painting, almost an academic approach to painting, where you set up a still life and you observe it and you try to translate that into a two-dimensional image with paint. That activity of looking at something and trying to translate that into a two-dimensional image, that's a lot of where my investigation begins. Throwing that not into a two-dimensional space, but literally putting those habits into a three-dimensional spaces, creating the illusion of 3 dimensions in 2 dimensions, and also the illusion of 2 dimensions in 3 dimensions in the same space, the same literal space. So they have turned into, it's kind of paintings in an installation framework, or maybe an installation in a painting framework, whichever way you want to define it. It allows for sculpture to happen, it allows for painting to happen, and it's to precisely confuse or where all these kind of overlap. Because a lot of my intent with some of these was for them to be in space, but when the viewing experience that you had would be as if you were looking at a flat painting, right?
Okay, so to me, that's work that marks a bit of a transition, or the beginning of a transition out of a kind of like academic, I think in his words, like academic approach to painting, where there's a big emphasis on control, technique, and perception. I think you talked about perceptual painting a lot. But also he would talk about like wanting to invite like poetry, I think was his word for it, into his work at that time. And I think in a way, and having heard him talk, 10 years later about that work, or 9 years later, he felt kind of, he didn't really want to participate in a like kind of white male dominated Eurocentric canon of painting. He didn't feel like that was like the home that he wanted to occupy. He wanted to do something a little different. And I think he started moving away from things that were kind of bound to that history and into something else. But he is talking about pitting these seemingly contradictory but simultaneous forces of 2-dimension and 3-dimension against each other inside of the same work. And I do think that kind of behavior continues right up through the work that we're looking at here at the MCA.
I mean, I'm just like, I haven't seen that video in a long time. I think I remember when we did that. That was a lot to just listen to. It's rare you hear somebody who sounds smarter than painting. Do you know what I mean? It's like, what? What? It's like, I need to replay that. But I think there's that, to your point, I feel like there was a moment when he was, he, like I said, he sort of came in with these chops, to steal your word, a word that Josh Dihle used to use in grad school was painting chops. He came in with these chops, with these skills, and I think got to a point where he kind of just started thinking beyond them, and he started seeing beyond them, and it was like sort of a natural kind of thing where things were starting to clearly go into space, and things I think what was so interesting at the time, I think, was there's a letting go of a certain precision, I think, when you move from painting to space. And there was there's an inevitable kind of makeshift quality to the material, to putting something together. And I think what's amazing is he was kind of able to sort of still see, in terms of painting, while he was kind of thinking in space and working in space, the material sort of shifts that happened from paint to string. It's the same line. It takes a certain, I think, way of thinking and seeing to be able to believe those things are the same in the work. And I think that's kind of, it just speaks to that sort of, I hope that makes sense to everybody, but that sort of development, just mental and visual development, and what a thing looks like and where it can be, and how, whatever kind of rules that we sort of were making up for it at the time in school, sort of, this is just what the thing is, and you can figure out how to describe it later, almost. But it's just kind of, he was really precise at that point. I think especially with that particular work that he's standing in front of, it was definitely, which is kind of gets me back to the work here a little bit, or the work in the show here, is that there is a kind of distillation process, and maybe there's a better word than that, but I think it's the same visual, it's the same way of seeing, but I think that things are just becoming a little bit more specific and a little bit sharper and a little bit sharper. And so a lot of the objects and work from the show, I think, are even sharper versions of the video that we were just seeing, of the work we were just seeing. Whether that be material or visual, talking about the difference between a white paint line on the wall and a string that extends from there. That makeshift sort of transition, to me, is still present in the show here. When you look at the paint on the tire, there's some looseness, there's still some makeshiftness, but there's also way more specificity, like much more intentionality. And I think there's a lot, there's like a clear kind of graduation in terms of not just concept, but also in terms of what the makeshift mark is doing. What the RIP is doing is different in 2012 or 2010, 11 when that video was, and what the RIP is doing in the show in the cloud drawing upstairs. But it's like, that's the same move, but it's straight up a graduation in terms of how we could be seeing and thinking of those things. But I think it's the same way of seeing.
Yeah, I also always kind of think of the 2-channel video work, one coinciding minute, as sort of a large-scale video version of a landscape painting. But to your point, it's a landscape painting that's entering 3-dimensional space, but also there's a kind of like failure or futility built into that work, which is to say, it offers the possibility of bringing you into 2 different places at once, but because you can't actually see both sides of the screen at the same time, that can only ever be a fantasy. The art object can only ever fail in that regard. And so there's almost like this exhaustion around representation that I think he's also contending with in his work. There's this kind of like, sense of always pushing against these limits, right? And so moving on to maybe some of the work that's based in found electronics, I'm curious when, if any of you remember, like when that shift might have happened. Were there any like particular shows or experiences that he had that maybe led him to, pivot in this way?
Did you say shift into working with
electronics? in particular?
electronics?
Yeah.
I mean, I could be wrong, but the first time I think I saw it was when he got back from Korea.
Yeah.
After that long residency, after that he had a substantial exhibition out there, that's, coming back with images and work that was clearly on a different frequency. And obviously, I think that was the first time we'd seen a fan plugged into the wall, attached to the wall.
Yeah, and
also
TV like strapped to the wall, like
and
facing
the
into the wall.
TV strapped to the wall, and also the treadmill.
That's right.
The treadmill piece that was the first time I'm seeing, plugs are needed for this work, and so, that was a pretty clear. I mean, those are 3 distinct moves that was present in that show, and I think that represented a bit of a shift. I think
It seems like getting a little bit of like, I don't know, like geographic space and just adjusting the context in which he was making his work was very liberating. I mean, I don't want to. That's just what it seems like. And I think when he came back in, was it 2015, the work he was making in 2014, 2015 was at that point like feet firmly planted outside of painting and outside of where he was coming in from. And I think he was starting to identify, he was activating the use of metaphor more strongly in his work. And there was a real crystallization there. And I think a lot of times the use of electronics or just moving parts in the artwork takes on all kinds of metaphorical implication, but in a way it points back to the self and bodies, and his body perhaps, like like something alive or moving.
I think it's kind of important to say that Greg had a contentious relationship with technology. Just who he was, he always had a broken phone that like you can't call, but he could call if it's only on speakerphone. So like that wasn't from his personal interest necessarily. And so I kind of, I don't know, I kind of think that maybe he kind of nestled into an impossible spot, but like the work seemed truer in a way because it existed relying on time moving and space, and kind of like seeing the work now, it's like, oh, he made it timeless.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I also think there was, Greg was extremely smart in a way that, I think he had a mind for how things were built. And I think that, to your point, I think there was I have many, many memories of him struggling with these self-made machines that would work, but they would also kind of break. They'd be around, or that piece would fall, or the only person that could get it going was Greg. That's right. That happened a lot, and it was, I think experiencing that, watching him do that, it turned it into a bit of, at least for me as a viewer, it turned it into a bit of a performative sort of relationship to these objects, which gave it, that much more intensity. But I think there's something about, and also I just want to make a quick point. We might be wrong about when he started getting into tech in general. We're not any experts or anything like that. It's just what we remember. So if somebody else might know something that we don't, but I think that's when we first. But I do think there was like semblances of that in graduate school, but it would come through in like wires, but it never came through in actual moving things. I think it started out as like a material thing, and then it was a question of, can I make this material move with a battery or with a plug? And I think things got a little more complicated, a little more interesting. You know what I mean?
And he was a tinkerer too. And you could see it in the Could we go to slide 3 on my list? There'd be like a real hodgepodge of different materials and there'd be these, and it would feel, it's like a mix of like offhand and fussy at the same time. And that was in the painting, but it was really like in the kinetic works that he was making as well. And I don't know, I remember going to American Science and Surplus with him one time. You guys know that store? And he had to go because he was getting some like circuits or something. And I was like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm making a car. What? He was like, I think he had the parts. He was like building his own stuff, and it was like held together with like chewing gum. And he'd like bake the Sculpey in his oven, and something would burn and melt. And it was just this like total kind of Frankenstein thing. But it also like was very much a product of his like a little bit of a DIY, like self-taught kind of way of working. And I think and it was such a like great place for him to like shine his light, like his brilliance into this kind of really authentic feeling contraptions that he would make, and that ultimately became artworks.
When he was a TA to me, I specifically remember him talking about his experience at RISD, where it was just absolutely drilled in this like academic traditional approach to painting. Like I remember him talking about like taping a brush to a stick and like having to do that. Do you think that was do you think that came from a rejection of that?
I would
just
think
evolving?
So. Yeah, I mean, because like just knowing how he worked, like I'm sure he was very good at that. But yeah, I think he did want to move away from that, and he wanted to put a little bit of the like retain a little bit of like amateur status and to not become like authoritatively good at a thing. And so what better way to do that than to like start building cars and electronics and things like yourself, Yeah.
I will just say on this note about these things breaking all the time, the clockwork that's on one of the clockworks in the show breaks like every single week pretty much. And so our team here, as a habit, just every Monday has to restart the clock, take the batteries out, put it back in. So his work, I don't know, I think it's kind of beautiful. It's like it's forcing us to care for it in this very sensitive, very sensitive way. And also those clocks weren't working as we were installing the show. It was this like, I don't know, magic moment the day the show opened. The clock in particular on the far right is the finicky one, and it just started ticking the day the show opened. So this whole process has been filled with coincidences sort of like that. So Josh, you mentioned him making a little car work, and I'm wondering if we could maybe pivot to 2018, which is maybe 2 or 3 years after he got back from Korea. And Mika, you worked with him on the Fourth Ward Project show in Hyde Park, which was titled New Instincts. And I'm wondering if you could talk us through like what that show was, what was the process like of working with him, and where was he at that point?
So I believe that it was in 2017 that we reached out to do a studio visit with him, and then asked him to do a show at Fourth Ward Project Space, which is a space that I co-founded alongside James Cow and Valentina Zamfarescu in Hyde Park, where Greg was also a Hyde Parker. And I guess I could say a little bit about like how we operate, or how Fourth Ward Project Space operates, because I think that ties into it. But we primarily show one artist, like solo shows, and the way that we select artists is like absolutely just like based on trust, both trust in the artist and trust in their work, their artwork. And so unless otherwise requested or specified, we, aren't going to say like, we came to your studio and we love this body of work. So oftentimes we like might not know what is going into the show like before install, or it's really like we leave it up to the artist how much they want to do their own thing or not. But also we operate like without regards to like any monetary incentives. Like we don't sell work. So whatever is going to help me take the next step, or whatever feels good at that moment. And his show is titled New Instincts. Can you pull up slide 1, please? I guess this is in the MCA show as well, or a Chicago Work show as well.
A version of it from the same
Yes,
series.
a version of it. There is, actually, I guess maybe we could go through a few of the slides. So maybe slide 2. This was, and then, slide 2 is, what's it called? Grinding on the Future. Okay. All these works were made in 2018. It's a store-bought remote control car, wax, bunch of stuff, mixed material. And it was also paired with, can you go to slide number 5, please? This is titled Untitled, parentheses, Wish You Were Here, 2018. It's a store-bought toy, a remote control car, and he specified that it was to be given away after the show. However, anybody could engage with it, play with it during the opening or whatever. It was flying all over the place. So can you go to slide 3? This is just a little snippet video. That's just Greg dodging the car. Okay, but let's see what I'm trying to think like what the best way to approach the whole show is. So maybe like in Shadow of Thought, slide 1. This is like very evident in this work. It's a dead screen. Screen emits light. He used fire to melt wax to specifically place it and cover it. It no longer emits light, and kind of forces one into like wishing one into a space where you have to look at it instead of look through it, which is what we do with light. That's something that, that's something I learned from him.
And for these works, these Shadows of Thought works, I think it's important to note that in the titles, there's always a name in the title. Like it's meant to be some sort of reflection of an individual person, right? And so maybe this continues this idea of, Greg kind of anthropomorphizing these electronic objects either as himself or as those who were close to him.
I wonder if, I'm not actually sure if this then, I wonder if this was the first iteration because it's titled just Shadow of Thought. Perhaps.
Maybe he added it in later. But certainly the one in the show, God, I forget who it's named after, but
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Fabulous.
He
Yeah.
was also always asking for broken computers.
I think, I distinctly remember, as I'm sure many people in the audience do, Greg asking for a dead laptop.
Yes, that's correct.
Or my
Yeah,
laptop.
yeah.
And I'm like, dude, it still works. I'm not giving you my laptop.
Oh man, I have one for him right now. And okay, can you move to slide 2, please? Thank you. Grinding on the future. Earlier in a conversation we talked about, you brought up pairings, which is very present in the Chicago Work show. That definitely exists with the show New Instincts from 2018. However, maybe not like so on the nose. Like this is. It's not framed as a pair. Obviously, there's a store-bought remote control car at the show as well. However, it's just speeding around the space, like around, not even in the gallery space, for people to engage with. I think, I think maybe rather than like couplings, pairings, there were two sides, different sides of the same coin type of thing. Even, of course, with the video, something that's like the two opposite ends that you're forced to like meet or see in the middle. And even with even with the radios, of course, that's a pair, and also these pairings repel each other.
Yeah, it was almost like I like that, two sides of the same coin, or like it felt like there was like a desire to orient within the ways he was like situating these things. So like that car, free to roam, untouched from the store. The other one is like very janky, handmade, and driving continuously into the wall, right?
Yes.
And I think I remember him talking about like those two. It really only the thing is only happening when both cars are being driven at the same time. Like he wanted, like there was a simultaneity to it that seemed really important to him. And then obviously that extends into the video pieces as well. But that there is, this kind of using the magnets to repel the two radios. They could maybe circle each other, they could play different stations, but they could never occupy the same space. But it did feel like, in a way, he was interested in making that a productive form of failure. Or I don't know if failure is the right word, but like the impossibility of that simultaneity, like really reaching a state of oneness, it seemed like he wanted to kind of have us sit in that space a little bit, and to kind of make that a place of reflection, or to make it into a productive problem for us and his audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And with Shadow of Thought specifically, it was he was trying to create shadow. Light is natural, and like, what do you do with shadow? You have to sit in it. It creates, or rather maybe forces, you to consider new instincts.
So the same year that Greg opened the show, he also founded Bill's Auto with Tony, an exhibition space in McKinley Park that is in the front space of your studio. And I'm curious to hear like how that all began and what was Greg like as a curator and collaborator?
Oh, geez. Greg and I and Josh, I think, would frequently joke about starting a space together for a while. And at the time, Josh and I run Julius Caesar. And we've been doing that for 8 years or so. At the time, I think it was like 2015, 2016, I think we probably asked Greg if he wanted to join a couple times. He was like, "No, I don't want to join Julius Caesar." And I was like, "That's totally fine." But then every time we'd hang out, every time we'd grab a drink, or we'd be traveling together, he'd be like, "Yeah, we should probably think about doing something." And, there was a time when, right around that time, 2018, Greg was already familiar with my studio. He would hang out at the studio all the time. We worked on projects together for a few years. And, he knew my studio pretty well. And my studio is an ex-auto repair shop. And it has a small little waiting room in front of it that's probably like 50, 60 square feet. It's really small, but it's an office space where you go wait in while your car's being worked on. It is no longer that, it is now a studio. But that front room was just a dead space for a while. And I approached Greg one day, I said, "Hey, we should do something with this front room. It's just sitting here, and I don't feel that I would be very good at curating anything. I don't think I want to talk to people that much. But it would be fun to have art in this room." And I was like, what if we just use it as like a temporary thing, and it could be like something we do that we talked about years ago? And he said, "Sure, I'm down for that." And so we like briefly started talking about it. And then we basically, I think the first time it happened, it was kind of sort of by accident. It was a plan, but it wasn't, we didn't really schedule anything. The room was empty. And so I think we painted the walls barely. There was a hole in the floor we didn't really fix. It was very dirty in there, very janky. Typically gallery spaces are nice and clean and white, and but like most tiny artist-run spaces, there's a little bit of jankiness, a little dirty.
It's character.
Yeah. So, I think Greg invited a friend of ours who's an incredible artist named Troy Briggs to display a work that actually Troy had exhibited years earlier in a show that Greg was in, that I organized in Cleveland. So I was familiar with the work. Greg was familiar with the work. We love Troy. It was like we all like each other. We all trust each other. Can we put this work in this room? And the work was, I don't remember the title of the work. If Troy's here, I apologize. But it was basically a sound piece that sit inside of a simple IKEA chair. And it had a phone, headphones hooked up to it. So to experience the work, you sit in the chair, you put the headphones on, and that was the piece. It was a wonderful piece. We put that room in the front gallery for about, I think we just did it one day, and it was there. And I would walk in every day, go to the studio, work, and then I would leave. And then I think we realized, we should probably tell people about this. We should probably, create a website we should probably maybe do an Instagram or something like that so people know that this is going on. And kudos to the third member of Bill's Auto, Shanae Lewis, who's in the audience over there, who's my sister, who's also my studio manager, who built a website for us, for Bill's, and worked on the Instagram for that, for Bill's. And then, so we basically said, all right, we have this thing, we'll plug it in, and let's have everybody over for a cocktail and do a closing. And so we did that, and it went really well. And I think that I think doing that, Greg realized that he could like have a party and galvanize people and like give somebody a chance to show work. I think Greg realized, oh, I like this. And things kind of developed from that point. I can't really, I mean, who Greg was as a curator was who he was as a person, which was unbelievably generous and unbelievably open, and usually focused on people who didn't really get a chance to show their work as much as other people. And so I think that's what motivated him in that front room. And so the picture you're seeing is one of the exhibitions we did with Q, which was an incredible exhibition. I can't get in the details of the show because it was just beyond brilliant in terms of what that show was. But this is a photo of Shanae and me and Q and Greg after we installed this poster that Q made for the show. The impact of that show for me was incredible, and it was something that I never thought I could experience. And I mean that on many levels of being like a Chicago art person or part of this community. This is the first time that, and maybe this is outing me as like somebody who doesn't go to shows very well, or who is not supportive enough in the past, but this is the first time I saw a show of Q's work since I lived in Chicago. Sorry, Q, if you're in the audience. I know you probably had shows before, but this was when I was like, oh man, I'm learning about who Q was, and I've known Q for a very long time. He was here in 2009 when I first got here, and Q is the one, not to put too much emphasis on you, Q, but Q's the one who literally, and everybody knows this, Q shows up to everything. Q shows up to everybody's show, to everybody's talk, to everybody's everything. And he's one of the most supportive and most kind people that works at the Art Institute. So shout out to Q in general, but totally. But when Greg asked him to do this show, I was like, oh, Q's gonna have a show. I didn't realize what that meant, but when Q had a show, everybody turned out for Q. And not only did everybody turn out for Q, Q made an incredible show. And just those two ideas happened because Greg made it so. And so I can't really explain what kind of curator Greg was without using that as just one example. It was groundbreaking. It was earth-shattering for me in terms to experience art in a way that I probably would not have experienced it otherwise. So, yeah.
Can I add that on that day that show opened, Greg also had a show opening?
A freaking group show.
That he's like gonna run to later.
Yeah, he was curating a show and then didn't say anything about that group show that he was in.
Yeah.
He was just like, all right, great opening, I gotta go to my show. Which was that at level 3?
Yes.
Yeah, that was at level 3.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, dude, way to tell anybody.
And also to add on to something you said earlier, Greg was like the biggest cheerleader for anyone. Like truly, I remember when I told him I had a Chicago Works show here at the MCA in 2018, and I remember when I told him, like, hey, I got this show, like, he was more excited than anybody else other than my boyfriend, Dan. Like, I was, like, we were in a car, and I was like, you're gonna make my Uber rating get all messed up, because you know, like, it was that genuine. Like, he's like, oh my God, that's like, you're probably like the first like Asian person showing there, Asian woman showing there in like so long, like, well, you know, like it was like that kind of thing was just the biggest win for him as well, like truly, genuinely.
So expanding out on this idea of Greg being a galvanizer of groups of folks, I wanted to talk a little bit about his activity with Goddamn and CAAU, which was Chicago Asian Pacific Islanders Artists United, formed in 2021 in response to, I believe, both pandemic isolation, but also the acts of anti-Asian violence that were taking place, particularly in Atlanta that spring. And just by way of preface for the activities of this group before we get into it a little bit, Mika asked that I share the initial email that Greg sent out to members of the Asian American community here in Chicago, inviting them to take part.
Can I look up the date that was sent?
Sure, yeah.
August 1st, August 1st.
August 1st, 2021.
August 1st, 2020.
Oh, 2020. Okay, so
yes.
it was even before spring 2021. Okay, so he writes, I'm reaching out to you personally about an initiative I've been meaning to take for a couple of years now. I'm forming an Asian American Artists Coalition of Chicago. I can no longer deny that I crave a community, so I'm organizing that community for us and by us. I want to make space for us to have a concerted voice and have agency in this city. My motive with the formation of the Asian American Artists Coalition of Chicago has political intent. I would like to see more of us with power, visibility, understanding, credibility, respect, affect, and effect. And I would like there to be less discrimination, insecurity, shame, hatred, fear, assault, and abuse in our experiences as Asian Americans in the arts. So Mika, maybe as a member, or early member of this collective, I'm curious to hear like what the experience was of being part of that group so early on, and what sort of ideas Greg had for the group.
I'm gonna have to look at my phone because I want to get like all these dates right to kind of like
Sure, yeah.
what like personally what like led up to that. Okay, so it was in mid-May of 2020 that he texted myself and James Cow, our friend, and also who runs Fourth Ward. He said, I had no idea May was Asian American Pacific Heritage Month. Did you guys know? And I said, oh, I just found that out like a few months ago. Okay. And then that was, yeah. Okay. So then August 1st, 2020, that was the first email. He sent that out initially, he sent that just out to people he personally knew, was friends with, and wanted to. It was an email out of the blue, and it was everybody immediately responded, and he was like, oh wow, I'm kind of overwhelmed by like the response that I've gotten and interest from everybody that this has gone out to. And then in August 2020, we had our first Zoom meeting, and then like maybe 2 weeks later, we had our first like personal or in-person gathering, like a picnic, and kind of just getting we all didn't know each other. It was Greg. Greg knew everybody, but like a lot of us didn't know each other. And yeah, that was still 2020. Okay, and then March 2021, Atlanta shooting. In response to that, that was insane. He like just went like off, and just like there was so much momentum, and he just took so much charge, and everybody, let's go, everybody, let's go. I can't believe it. He put together a fundraiser plan in, let's see, mid-May of 2021, and raised over $15,000. Like, this timeline is really insane. Like, I think, so yeah, March 2021 shootings, and in April, it was like, I want to try to organize this, and then in mid-May, the fundraiser, just reaching far beyond the initial amount of, just the goalpost. And oh yeah, here's there's several slides of some of the Zoom meetings we had. Obviously, it was the pandemic, but I think it's, let's see, slide 9. Yes, this was from the CAAU in like CAAU Art Advancing Justice fundraiser, virtual party or whatever we called it. And he like organized programming for it with speakers. These are the speakers. Greg was the master of ceremonies. Larry Lee was moderating conversation. There's James Cal, S.Y. Hung, and also, I'd like to say that, just to give credit, all of these screenshots were provided to me by Jin Lee, so thank you. But the timeline was like, it's still astonishing to me, the way it really was single-handed. He single-handedly did this. And he urged everybody to not be passive, and we all said yes.
Yeah, and it's shocking that so few of the members knew each other before Greg formed this group. I mean,
yes.
When I got here, it seemed like everyone had really formed this like cohesive community almost, or something. And it's hard to believe that it was entirely him that was doing that.
He really yearned for it, and I think it's important to say that it wasn't in response, like this didn't start in response to the Atlanta shootings. But I think I have so after the fundraiser, he immediately sent out an email saying, what's next? What's next? We need we need to support other like brown and black communities, like, and get together and support each other. Like he was, that's how far ahead he was thinking, like the day the fundraiser was over. And also, I think there wasn't a like Asian American community of artists in Chicago before, like, really, that was, that was a group. And there is now.
My God, we're like almost at time for Q&A, but and there's too much to get to in an hour, of course. But maybe before we open it up, the last question I wanted to end on was sort of this question of maybe legacy and why maybe during his lifetime he didn't receive as much attention maybe as he deserved for his work. My understanding is that was sort of a sentiment that was felt. And I'm curious to hear if there are any thoughts on that and maybe like where we go from here.
So I think, there's no one answer to that. I feel like part of, like, the flip side of Greg's great generosity was also a bit of selflessness. And he wasn't like on social media really. He wasn't like a big self-promoter. He was a great enthusiast, but he wasn't trying to like self-promote in the way that sometimes artists have to in order to like kind of get themselves out there. I also think that there wasn't, his work is challenging. His work is not like easily summarized. There's no elevator speech for Greg's work. And so the legibility and the sightlines hadn't yet necessarily emerged within the community. And, it's credit to you and to the people who are recommending that you look at his work to kind of bring it to light, because obviously the work is like fully formed and brilliant and, important and incisive. But, there's also like I think there's more talent in this town than there is opportunity too. So like, I think it took a special set of circumstances to kind of shine a light on his work.
I think that it also just has to be acknowledged that he was an Asian American male artist. I'm just gonna say that. But that a separate point. His work is not archival. It's not museum friendly in that way, and it's hard to imagine like something as, I think, like the video piece in the Chicago Work Show is I couldn't have imagined that work being like elevated to that level of like what it's trying to achieve, because usually it was on like projected onto sheets or a wall,
Yeah, it's when you think of legacy, when you're thinking about, why it took so long or why it didn't happen the way it should have, and when it should have happened. I think a lot of people said no to Greg when they probably should have said yes. I think it took too long for him to get a teaching gig in this town, and I think but at the same time, I completely agree with both Mika and Josh on this point, because I had several conversations with Greg about this very thing, and about what it meant to sort of what an artist needs to do, to sort of get their work out there, and what an artist doesn't need to do. Should they self-promote, or does it take somebody to vouch for you? And I would argue, it takes all that stuff. And we would talk a lot about literally, you know, even to the point of like whether or not the work should change, or whether or not, you know, you like a lot of people have to do, you know, and maybe this is ironically actually something that has to do with Chicago, but you know, a lot of people that might deserve a teaching gig or deserve a residency, they might not be able to get it here, and they got to go somewhere else to get it. I think that's, and it's kind of like, that is part of the you know, situation that is just it can be draining, and it really can. It can affect how you feel about yourself. It can affect the way you see your own value. But I think at the same time, I firmly believe that, and I know for a fact that Greg knew his value. Like, he knew that the work was good. He just knew that certain spaces or certain opportunities or certain people making these decisions were just stupid or racist or overlooked him. And maybe they just didn't realize it. But I think, but it also, it's a reflection of a certain type of commitment and sacrifice that I think Greg was committed to making. I think from the very beginning. I think I always believed that Greg was a long-term kind of artist. I always believed that he knew what he was doing, and he had a plan for where he wanted these things to go and how he wanted them to sort of succeed, and when he thought the world would catch up to them. I believe that. And I think at the same time as he might have had that sort of mindset, it still sucks to get a rejection letter. You know what I'm saying? It still sucks to sort of have to deal with, you know, just the weight of what it's, of whether or not you know, the weight of, do I have to change something about myself, or am I enough to sort of be here in this position? Do I deserve this particular platform or opportunity? It's a constant battle every day. I think it's a constant thing you think about. It's insecurity, it's overconfidence, it's doubt, and it is, you know, personal sort of commitment. And I think that's a big part of being an artist. I think that's a big part of being an artist of color. I think, you know, it's so funny. I think in the recent years, you know, when we first went to grad school, Greg and I really never talked about, you know, I didn't talk about being, and maybe this is because we had like our own psychological hang-ups about it. But when I would talk about my work eventually, I didn't really talk about being a Black artist. Maybe because I was unsure about how to do that. And Greg didn't really talk about his work in terms of being a Korean American artist. And I'm not gonna say why, but I do know when we used to talk about art in graduate school, we talked about it formally, conceptually, in terms of material. We talked around the thing a lot. And I think as we got a little older, and as, you know, the world got a little colder, and as we sort of got more tired, I think more recently, he started to be a little bit more concerned about this, about who he was and what the art was doing to reflect who he was. And it would creep up in conversations. We started out about material, but we'd get to the fact that earlier that day he was at a bus stop and somebody started yelling at him for no reason. And that really pissed him off, as it should. Why is some random dude coming up to you, pushing you, and telling you to get out of the way, yelling at you? Why are they doing that? When you walk into your studio with that kind of energy, I mean, it's hard not to sort of make with that sort of, you know, that sort of intensity or that sort of anger, or just think about it or want to talk about it more. So I think on some level, Greg was a brilliant maker who dealt with a lot of extra stuff. And I think there are brilliant makers on this stage who also deal with extra stuff. And, to a certain extent, I think that's a big part of, of what makes the work what it is. But it's, when we have conversations about legacy, I think there is no doubt in terms of Greg's legacy. The amount of people, the people on the stage, the people in the audience, that's what we're here for now. I think it's literally our job. And I think there's plenty of people that'll be willing to work for that and do what needs to be done.
Can I ask, in the earlier conversations where that you mentioned, where you're both skirting or talking about everything except for race, did he have tropes in his work at that time referring to his Asianness?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there was moments when you would see a pattern that would be from a particular Korean design or signifier, but it wouldn't be the subject matter. It would be something that was embedded inside a thing.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it's important to say that Asian Americans weren't allowed the language to even discuss that, or allowed that to consider that until 2020.
Right. And it's one of those things where we would have conversations because we'd spend time in each other's studio. He would be in my studio, and he'd see a work and he would understand. I would deal with a lot of text in my work, and not to be selfish to talk about my art right now, but there's a lot of things that is embedded in the work that, for one reason or the other, you feel the need to hide. But hiding doesn't necessarily mean hiding, in a negative sense. It was a strategy. It was a learned strategy that helped you build a better picture. It helped you build a second language. And I think those sorts of muscles and those sort of muscle memories, conceptual muscle memories, connected to the way that you dealt with material and the way that you felt that you needed to talk about the work publicly, because the way that we discussed the work privately was very clear and simple. But the way that we would have to, for most artists, the way we'd have to perform the language around a work publicly was a different thing. It is a different thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's tough to navigate that. So to your point, 100%, I think that was there. And I think it was one of those things where you can't really say in a room full of people because because you think it's wrapped up in your own self-consciousness, you think it's wrapped up in your own ability to let the work be something greater than that, right?
If you say it, then you run the risk of being cornered in, or okay, you're an Asian artist making using traditional Korean floral wallpaper patterns or whatever the hell. Of course you get categorized. So absolutely, I think that was.
But I also think he used to slide those things in there just as a way to be a bit of an educator. I think he wanted to be able to put things in a place that people didn't know, so that maybe he would get asked about it, so then he could explain it.
Yeah.
I think that he did that with the work a little bit, and then I think that sort of way of being an educator, or just as a way of sort of bringing things together or connecting the dots. I feel like that was just an uphill battle in the work, but I think it was something that he maybe felt that he needed to do for whatever reason.
He created such great incentive to dig underneath of the surface too. Yes. He was such a maker. He is so, that scroll is a kind of a mind-blowing piece that X radios. Yeah. And it's layered, and it's just really a masterpiece unto itself. I think it's 60 feet long, something like that. and there's like a material layer, there's a kind of a fastidious makerly layer, there's a kind of a breezy casualness to it, and then there was something that was like really about him, or about Greg, or about his experience and what he was bringing into the studio on a given day. Like, he made space for that in the work, but he also made space for an audience to really to find it and to take their time in finding it. And that's, again, part of the subtlety and the nuance of his work, but it's also like partly why it maybe didn't get big flashy shows, right away, but it's getting it now.
I don't think he was trying to hide anything.
Okay.
I think he was totally transparent. However, there's so much to discover.
Yeah. I
Fair
agree.
enough. Yeah.
I'm sorry to cut this short, but I think we have to open up the questions. We have like 5 minutes. If there are any comments, questions, anything.
I wanted that slide in there because it's a great picture.
There's a mic headed your way.
I guess mine's more of a comment than a question, but I just feel like hearing you all describe the work, it like brings back so many memories. But also, and I appreciate the formality of all this and so many people being here, but there was also a level of working with Greg that was just so casual and fun, and the work was tedious, but also so playful. And so I think he had so much fun and played around with the work when he brought that scroll and was finishing it at level 3. I was like, so how do you want to display it? And he was like, I don't know. How do you want to do it? We just played around in the space. And so I think, to me, there was a quality of his personality and bringing people together, and also like how the work really reflected him and his personality that was so strong in it too. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, and if there's one thing that the Chicago Works show is missing, or one aspect of the work that's not there, I would say it's that. But my hope is that this is not the only show. This is the first show of many to come. But yeah, thank you. Are there any other comments, questions? Okay. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the audience, and have a lovely... Oh, wait, was there one more? Oh yeah, in the front.
Hi, I'm Shauna Hunter. I'm married to Seth Hunter, who is part of this, what Hamza Walker called a vintage year, when all these guys were in grad school together. And I got to come down and visit quite a bit. And Greg's artist talk was one of the few that I got to go to, and that was just a significant, satisfying pleasure to just, see, like Tony said, the brilliance of it all, just very impactful. But I think really what I wanted to share is kind of being an outsider looking in as all of this is starting to form is, I'm gonna cry, just watching the generosity that these guys had for each other. They all really appreciated each other's work. They supported each other. They showed their work together, and it was such a pleasure to watch everything from the beginning. It's one of the reasons that we stayed here in Chicago. Was because of the community, and it was people like Greg and his genuineness. I mean, we had the guy house sit for us one time. He left us a note that said, I had a little much to drink and dumped cat food in your cat litter box, and I'm sorry. But I mean, I think the legacy, Greg's legacy, is because of you. It's because of the effort that you've made, and I just it's a privilege. It's a privilege to watch You model such a generous and talented environment for generations.
I think, oh, yeah.
I don't think we could end this without acknowledging, Nolan, your role.
Here, here.
I mean, there's like how this came together in the beginning, to begin with. You didn't know Greg. That's astounding, and there's just no person who could have done this this well, like truly.
Thank you. I'm so embarrassed, but thank you. And on that note, thank you for coming. Thank you, panelists.